I want to solve a Rubik's Cube without actually touching it. How is that possible? Well, you could take the easy way out and just put some gloves on. Now you can solve it no problem, and you're technically not touching it, but I think we can all agree that's about the lamest interpretation possible. Instead, we could challenge ourselves to only touch it with some other objects, like 2 more Rubik's Cubes. I think that would be a really fun challenge, but it's still not quite what I'm going for. No, I want to be able to solve this Rubik's Cube without it making contact with my hands or any other object. So how is that possible? Well, like many problems in cubing, we're going to try and solve it with the power of magnets. As I'm sure you all know, you can exert a surprisingly strong force on one magnet using another opposing magnet. This is the idea behind maglev. So what if we just put a bunch of smaller magnets like this inside a bunch of the pieces of this cube, and then we can use a bigger magnet to push it around however we want. Now, of course, we can't just use any old speed cube that's already been magnetized. For one thing, the magnets are way too small and buried way too deep within the puzzle to meaningfully interact with a bigger magnet like this one. And another issue is that these magnets are designed to help the cube click into place and stay that way, whereas we actually want the exact opposite. We want the cube to be as loose and easy to turn as possible so that even the slightest magnetic force pushing against it will be able to complete a turn. So to avoid all those issues, I'm going to be starting over from scratch with a brand new, cheap, unmagnetized cube, the Chi Sail W. I'm also going to be using these huge magnets rather than the usual small ones to get as big of a repulsion force as possible. These were left over from the world's strongest magnetic cube, so I already know that they'll fit inside of this cube. And unlike that strongest magnetic cube, where we put pairs of magnets as close together as possible in between the edges and corners for a really strong click, we're going to be doing the exact opposite here. We're going to be trying to space out the magnets as far away as possible. That way they don't interact at all and don't make the cube any harder to turn. I think the most obvious way to do it is just to put magnets in all of the corners. That way, again, they're spaced out as far away as possible. And also, that repulsion force will actually allow us to turn the cube. If we put magnets in the edges instead, you can imagine that repulsion force wouldn't really do very much. So let's go ahead and open this cube up and make sure those magnets will fit like I think they will. Each corner on this cube has a little cap that pops off like this, and as you can see, there is plenty of room inside. I think I'm basically going to put one magnet underneath each one of the stickers, that way we can push it from any direction that we want. And I think the only problem we might run into is this cap not fitting on properly, so I might have to cut some plastic off of that afterwards, but that should be no big deal. So without further ado, let's go ahead and break out the super glue and get magnetizing. I'm still a little bit skeptical this will have the effect that I want it to in the end, but hey, it's worth a shot, and hopefully we can fix any issues that come up. Alright, that was a lot more difficult than I expected. I thought gluing magnets facing the outside of the pieces would be just as easy as facing the inside, but turns out just because of the shape of the pieces and how the magnets like to attract to each other, it was a lot more difficult and I lost a lot of skin in the process. The magnets also didn't fit as well in this position. The pieces are a lot uglier. You can even see the magnets poking out in a few spots where I had to cut down the caps, but none of that should really matter in the end, as long as the cube remains more or less the same functionality wise, and fortunately, it does seem to turn exactly the same as a non-magnetized cube. So I think we did a good job of keeping those magnets as far away as possible. So why don't you say we try it out? I got another big magnet here that we can use to repel the magnets. So let's go ahead and, okay, that's not quite right. I think I can fix that though by spinning it around. And now I can really feel that repulsion force. But now it's just attracting to the other piece, which isn't exactly ideal. I mean, we are turning the cube, but we are definitely touching it in the process. I feel like part of the problem is there's just a little bit too much friction inside of the cube. Like, I feel like I'm really pushing it right now, but it's just not quite enough to overcome that plastic and really get it to turn until I get it so close that it just starts attracting to things that I don't want it to. So what I'm gonna try and do is reduce the friction as much as possible in the turning of this cube. A lot of that friction comes from the actual screws and springs. Ideally, I would replace it with maglev, so we have basically no friction. But because I don't care about how this cube turns, I'm instead just going to take the springs out entirely. This will make the cube feel really floppy and annoying to turn with your hands. That was unexpected, but hopefully the decrease in friction will be a net gain in terms of making it easier to turn with magnets. Okay, I think the reduction in friction was a success. It definitely feels like it takes a lot less force to start a turn, even if it also feels a lot more terrible. And another thing that I wasn't expecting is having such strong magnets in all the outer pieces kind of forms a weak sort of maglev between all of them. You can kind of see they naturally spread apart a little bit more than they would otherwise because they're literally repelling each other from this far away. So hopefully that'll also work to our advantage, but just to make sure we have as little friction as possible, I'm also going to do one more thing and add a few drops of DNM37 just to make this cube super frictionless. this. Okay, so just working that in, it feels extremely easy to turn now. If you guys remember back to when I tried to make the fastest turning cube, I think I've accidentally done a lot of those same things here, and we can pretty easily do a U4 on this thing. Insane. But of course, that's not the point of this. The point is to be easily repelled by a magnet. So let's go ahead and try that out again. And that's definitely a little bit more promising than before. I feel like I'm kind of using a mix of repelling and also attracting these pieces. If we can attract to a piece like this and then sort of pull it along without actually touching it, I think that's a viable strategy too. It's definitely going to take a lot of practice. As you saw there, it was very hard to not accidentally touch it to the cube, which of course we want to avoid. I have been trying out some alternative strategies, such as holding the magnet sideways, which sometimes seems to work a little bit better, or even like moving the magnet really quickly back and forth, which sometimes seems to get it moving when it's kind of stuck. But you may have noticed there's still one big problem with this picture. I said I was going to solve a Rubik's Cube without touching it, but have a look at this. I'm still touching it. I don't think it'd be very practical to just set it down on the table. You'd be pushing and pulling it everywhere where you don't want it to be, and it'd be very hard to actually start a turn without something holding it in place. So instead, we need some way to rigidly mount the cube to the table such that we're still able to turn all sides, but we don't have to touch it in order to do those turns. We probably want to attach it by one of the centerpieces. That'll give us the most easiest range of motion because we can still turn all 5 sides around it. So as usual, I designed and then 3D printed a stand that goes into one of the centerpieces and allows it to be easily mounted to the table. And here it is. As you can see, it's shaped perfectly like the inside of a centerpiece, so we can go ahead and stick it in there and it will stay very firmly attached. And now we can go ahead and tape it down to the table so that it won't go anywhere. Now introducing the table cube. It's a Rubik's Cube, but it's also permanently attached to your table for the utmost inconvenience. Buy it now at z3cubing.com. Anyway, the real question is, can we easily turn it with a magnet? And the answer is, well, kind of, yeah. I found that holding it at 45 degrees like this is both the easiest to turn it while the least likely to accidentally touch the cube where you don't want it to. It still is a little bit floppy. I'm thinking about maybe tightening the sides, but after a little bit of work, we can definitely turn each side that we want to. Of course, doing U and D moves is going to be a bit of a mess because once that middle layer gets misaligned, there's basically going to be no way to fix it because there's no magnets in those edge pieces, but I think we might just be able to get it to work. This is somehow both way more awkward and difficult than I imagined it would be in my head, while also being way more possible than I was afraid it might be as I was making it. Now, without further ado, we can make sure our table cube is nice and scrambled up, and then we can go ahead and start solving it without touching it in 3, 2, 1, and go. Now, one thing that I did not consider is it's impossible to rotate this cube, and I can't really move my head to look, so I'm not quite sure where all the white pieces are or where I should be looking. I did just see that that one is green, so let's bring it around to the front, and then hopefully bring it down into its spot in the cross. Okay, bizarrely, I found twisting the magnet kind of helps suggest what direction you want it to turn. So there we go, there's the green edge, and I also found this red one in the process that we will now also put in. Okay, as I get this last cross edge here in the back, I feel like I'm finally starting to get some fine motor control of this cube. I'm actually able to turn what side I want to just by aligning the magnet in the right way. And that is our cross complete. I just reached my head across the table to check and see that this F2L pair is in fact correctly set up. So I'm gonna go ahead and bring that around to the back of the cube where it needs to go. And F2L pair number 1 is complete. I'm so glad this is actually working. And it looks like we're gonna move on to this next one in the front here. There's the second F2L pair. I just looked behind the cube to see that this one is not quite inserted correctly, so let's go ahead and fix that one. Okay, there's another F2L pair right there. Let's move on to the third one. There's the third one. I have literally no idea what's going on in the back. It could be solved for all I know, but again, I have no cube rotation, so I can't really tell. Oh yeah, that was the first F2L pair that we did. I'm an idiot, so I guess F2L is actually complete. So do we dare try this OLL? I think we should. Well, I messed that up spectacularly, so time for a new OLL. If you thought remembering algorithms with one hand was hard, try doing it with no hands. Anyway, it looks like we do have an A-perm, which should be nice and easy to finish it off. We just have to painstakingly do all the right moves, which is gonna be just as hard for this one. All right, roughly 30 minutes later, and it's time for the last 2 moves. You can see just how much of a struggle it is to do a single one and get it perfectly lined up for the last. The U and D moves were definitely the most difficult because that middle layer got misaligned, but it seems like it cooperated for us for that last move, and there it is, Rubik's Cube complete, no touching. Of course, there were a few brief incidental touches here and there where you accidentally go, whoops, but most of the time it hurt rather than help me, so I'm gonna count it. But just to make sure you're holding me accountable, I am gonna try one more time with absolutely no mistakes. Maybe I'll try and do it as fast as possible too, and I'll upload that separately and link it in the description. But for the time being, I am satisfied. I think I've gotta be the first person to ever solve an entire Rubik's Cube without touching it to anything, except of course the table. And for that matter, I guess it's also touching a lot of air in this room, so I guess an alternate valid strategy would be like this. Anyway, that was one of the more impossible challenges I've tried in a little bit, so I really hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.